Record. Right. Hello, everyone. So today we are talking about negative virtue, natural vice, and Gothic sensibility in Anne Radcliffe's The Romance of the Forest. Now, I don't know how many people will have read this book. I know I've talked about it before, so sorry, there's going to be a little bit of repetition in terms of definitely laying out the plot for people, but I am going to presume that not everyone's read it. I am going to give you a little bit of a plot summary, and I am going to go over some of the kind of foundations of our interaction with this book as well. So first of all, let me introduce you on this International Women's Day to Anne Radcliffe herself, the great enchantress. Now, Joan Passy makes quite a hyperbolic claim, perhaps, about Radcliffe, but says that there is no Gothic without Anne Radcliffe. That Radcliffe is so central to the Gothic that Radcliffean Gothic is almost a tautology. Now, this, as I said, is perhaps a little bit hyperbolic, but it does point to the ways in which Anne Radcliffe was so central in the development and in the popularity of the early Gothic. So that's in the 18th century. And the main area, kind of time period in which Radcliffe was active was in the 1790s, that real efflorescence of the Gothic. And her importance was not only recognized today by critics, but was recognized at the time, and particularly by sort of the generation that came after her, her contemporaries, who a lot of sort of the younger writers who were in that second generation of romantics report reading her as teenagers. You know, De Quincey is the one who refers to her as the great enchantress of her generation, Keats as Mother Radcliffe, Nathan Drake as the Shakespeare of romance writers. And Walter Scott sort of sets her aside from the other Gothic writers, who he's often quite critical of as producing formulaic or kind of oversimplified books. Radcliffe is his exception. She is the good Gothic writer. Although he also points to something about her legacy, which is worth noting briefly. He, again, there's a bit of overstatement going on here, but he says she was as retired and sequestered as the fame of her writings was brilliant and universal. Now, that's not quite true, but Radcliffe was a really quite private person. After the publication of her final book in 1796 as well, she pretty much disappears from the public and the literary eye as a writer. There are some biographies of her, but there's a lot of gaps in what we know about Radcliffe. What we do know is we know her through her writings, and she wrote 6 novels, only 5 of which were published before her death. There's also in 1795 a series of travel writings detailing her journeys not through France or Italy, the places where she sets her novels, which she never went to, but instead she goes to Holland, Germany, and parts of the UK, particularly sort of the north of England. But as I said, so there are 6 novels. One of them, The Gaston de Blondeville, published in 1823, was published posthumously. The others all published within sort of less than a 10-year span. When people talk about Radcliffe and Radcliffe's Gothic, they are usually talking about the sort of central 4 texts. So Sicilian Romance from 1790, The Romance of the Forest from 1791, Mysteries of Udolpho from 1794, and The Italian from 1796. Not many people talk about the Castles of Athlone and Dunbayne. It owes a lot more in terms of its plot. It has a very similar plot in some ways to the work of Horace Walpole or Clara Reeve, who came before. So it has a medieval setting. It has somebody who seems to be a peasant that's actually the true heir. It's in a Sicilian Romance that we see Radcliffe really bringing her own style to the fore. And that's why I sort of say any kind of concept of the Radcliffean Gothic is usually based on these 4 novels. Now, there is this sense that there is a Radcliffean Gothic formula as such. And so I'm going to use that formula to introduce you to the plot of the novel for those of you who might not have read it before. So there is a female protagonist, and in Romance of the Forest, this protagonist is Adeline. Now, she's not the first character that we meet. It's my favorite opening of any Radcliffe novel, I have to admit, because it pushes us straight into the action. And we start with the Motte family, who are fleeing from Paris because the patriarch of the Motte family, Pierre Motte, is being pursued for debt and card sharping, essentially. But as they are riding across the windy moors of France, they get lost at night. Pierre Motte comes out of the carriage. He's wandering around trying to sort of find help. And he ends up at this ramshackle building, which is clearly inhabited by some form of criminal. And what he finds when he's there is that they are holding prisoner a young woman. And that is our Adeline. She's being held prisoner, in fact, by the man that she considers to be probably her father. But what happens is that the ruffians say, take this girl with you and don't look back. And so she ends up traveling with the Motte family and joining their exile. So they end up stopping in a forest, the forest of the title, which is where they sort of settle in this ruined abbey that you can see in the picture in the center, if you can see that picture. Another feature of many Radcliffean novels is the noble but ineffective hero. And we have two possibilities in this novel. We have Louis, who is the son of the Mottes, who doesn't go with them in exile. He is a soldier and he comes and finds them. And he, if I'm honest, is the better choice. But there's also Theodore. And in the sort of Gothic way, he ends up being related to a load of the other principal characters in some way. But he's introduced to us, it's a little bit random. He's the guest of the villain. But when I say noble but ineffectual, or ineffective, it's because a lot of these heroes, they don't really end up being successful in what they try and do. So Theodore tries to rescue Adeline after she's kidnapped by the villain, and more on that later. But he doesn't get very far. He stops for a rest. He ends up having 2 duels, getting almost mortally wounded, and then being court-martialed. And he spends the rest of the novel in prison. So he is very ineffective at trying to save the heroine. Now, villains are, of course, a key part of the Gothic, and we have 2 villains, I would say, in this book. A primary villain who is outright evil, and a secondary villain who is a much more mixed character, but ends up being a specific threat to Adeline. And that is actually Pierre de la Motte, so the father of that family that she goes with in the beginning. Because while there's no threat to him, he's very happy to offer her shelter, and he feels a great deal of pity for her. But this is a man on the run. And when he's in his ruined abbey hideout, he's still struggling for money. He's still kind of worried about his position. And one day, in a fit of madness, as he's in the forest, he sees a rich traveler and he robs him. And that turns out to be the Marquis de Montalt, who is our true villain, FYI. The Marquis de Montalt is, in a Gothic twist of logic, also the owner of the abbey. So, oh no. And basically, La Motte ends up making a deal with the devil to give the Marquis de Montalt Adeline in order to keep himself safe. Now, the Marquis de Montalt is our primary villain. He's the one who's quite magnetic. He's quite tyrannical. And in this case, he's an aristocrat, not a clergyman. And he wants to sleep with Adeline, essentially. And he doesn't care about her consent in this arrangement, pretty much. We also have him, it's revealed later, he's a villain on a larger scale. He's the one who is kind of behind the secret of the abbey. And the secret of the abbey is that a man was murdered there, and the Marquis de Montalt was behind that murder. And it just so happens that the man who was murdered was Adeline's real father. So you can see the circular connected plots of the Gothic novel coming out here. Now, as we can tell by the fact that the ruined abbey is central to the text, there are religious institutions here, and the abbey functions as a place of both entrapment and refuge for Adeline and arguably the Motte family as well. There's also a convent that hovers in the wings of this novel, and Adeline kind of wants to take refuge in a convent, but she never makes it because the Marquis de Montalt kidnaps her. So he kidnaps her once, Theodore rescues her, Theodore fails, and the Marquis de Montalt kidnaps her again. Classic. So, of course, there are ruins, in this case, a ruined abbey, and lots of sublime landscapes. And Adeline spends quite a lot of time having sensibility moments in the forest, writing some really dull poetry. We also have the supernatural explained, or do we? So the supernatural explained, the idea that supernatural instances are resolved in a natural or rational kind of explanation at the end, is something that is considered key to Radcliffe. But I'd say this book pushes our understanding of that in interesting ways. I'd say the supernatural is much more ambiguous. The castle is reported to be haunted, and throughout, Adeline has these experiences of hearing sighs, sometimes hearing voices, and seeing a figure that she comes to believe was actually a ghost. It becomes quite ambiguous because nothing is ever fully resolved. And also she has very clearly supernatural dreams, 4 of them in the novel. And the ghost sighting ties in with 3 of them. So there is an ambiguous sense of the ghostly here and a real sense of supernatural dreams. Now, we have not a superstitious servant, but a garrulous servant, which is in the style advocated by Walpole, that there should be some servants who talk a bit too much and act as comic relief. But Peter, the servant here, he does that. She tries to kind of make him a figure of fun, but he is also the most practical and helpful character in the book in terms of actually rescuing Adeline, because it's him that rescues Adeline and takes her away to the place that he is from, where she meets the family that was actually going to be her point of safety. And in the end, we have a happy ending. Theodore survives. She and Theodore get married, and everybody's happy. Now, obviously, those of you who know me know that I have an issue with recipes like this. It's helped me to give you a basic idea of some of the plot, but it's also narrowed down what I've been talking about to some extent. And I've missed out some of the subplots, but also some of the key subtexts and themes that the book is interacting with through using this kind of recipe. For example, I haven't talked about the way in which the text deals with questions of martial and civil justice at great length, nor have I sort of talked about the Leluc family, which is the family she comes to sort of end up with when she's finally kind of rescued. And that's also turns out to be Theodore's dad, of course. But I haven't talked about the way that there is this kind of production of a quasi-Protestant family that models particular forms of virtue in the text for us. So one of the problems with this kind of recipe is it limits the way in which we interact with the text. So I do always want to tell people, take this with a pinch of salt. There are kind of lots of things which exist outside of this, even within a novel that seems to follow it quite closely. So I'm just going to take a second to deepen that thought before I go back to Anne Radcliffe's Romance of the Forest, with a quick note on the female Gothic, because this Radcliffean Gothic is often referred to as a female Gothic. But as many of you will know, I have a bit of an issue with this. I think it's quite a reductive idea to think that there is such a thing as a female Gothic. But Ellen Ledoux's article, which I really recommend, it's open access, so anybody can read it. She makes the point that this term female Gothic was retrospectively or retroactively applied. This is not a genre that people thought that they were writing in. Instead, this is a critical term produced in the mid-20th century. She notes that the category female Gothic more accurately reflects the ideological goals of second wave feminist literary criticism, i.e. the recuperation of female writers and the sense of a specific female tradition of writing. And she says that it represents the narrative, so it represents second wave feminist literary criticism more than it represents the narratives of early women Gothic writers such as Clara Reeve, Sophia Lee, and Charlotte Dacre. While critics, including Robert Miles, Alison Milbank, Emma Cleary, and Diane Hoyviller, among many others, have attempted to refine the term female Gothic, its usage has limited the ways in which scholars approach women's Gothic writing. And that's the key takeaway, I think. It limits the ways in which we can interact with this writing. Women-authored texts that do not feature female Gothic tropes, a distressed heroine, domestic incarceration, threats of sexual violence, anxiety about monstrous or absent mothers, are often given little critical attention. And as I and others have argued elsewhere, however, women's early Gothic writing, a great deal of which is only accessible to us because of the recovery work of feminist scholars, is much more aesthetically, politically, thematically, and generically diverse than the female Gothic categorization suggests. So that's the second major takeout, that the female Gothic, or the women-written Gothic, is much more engaged with questions of aesthetics, politics, in my case, religion, I'm really interested in, but it's also doing that in very diverse ways. If we say that there is a female Gothic, we're suggesting that these books are essentially doing the same thing, but that's not true. And what we're going to be looking at today is the way in which Radcliffe specifically engages really closely and quite complexly with different contemporary discourses, both philosophical and theological, of virtue. But before I go back to Radcliffe, let me just highlight this kind of concept of generic diversity. Now, the first book on the left, if you can see the cover, it looks like a pulp cover from the 20th century with a green monster on the front. Now, of course, this wasn't the original. This is a modern publication, but I kind of love it. I love this cover. It's got almost nothing to do with the plot, which is great as well. But one of the things that I want to point out about this is by Sarah Wilkinson, and she is writing for a very different audience to Radcliffe in some ways. She's writing for the chapbook audience. So she's writing shorter stories at a much cheaper price, and for an audience probably of a lower class. Now, I'm not saying working class here, but she is pitching this towards a different kind of demographic, essentially. And her stories are inflected by that as well. As the cover suggests, although it is a bit misleading in terms of what the supernatural presence is, the Midnight Embrace does feature a supernatural presence, in this case, an avenging ghost. It's a lower class woman who's been taken advantage of by a local lord. She's been murdered by him, but she comes back on the day of his wedding, dances with him, embraces him, and kind of drags him off into the afterlife with her. But this has a very different focus to that sort of Radcliffean Gothic, very different features as well, even though there are some similarities in its interest in the position of women, both kind of socially and legally. Charlotte Dacre's The Fleur of the Moor, very famously, is sort of a female version, or is thought of as a female version of The Monk by Matthew Lewis. So in this case, you have Victoria, who goes on this downward path, making deals with the devil and ending up committing a number of crimes, including rape, murder, and kidnap. But here you don't have that pattern of virtuous heroine and landscape appreciation in the same way. In fact, it's investigating a very different kind of story. We've also included here The Mysterious Warning by Eliza Parsons, in the picture of which we can see a woman begging for her child's life in a jail and a man throwing on the floor the water that would save her baby. The reason I quite often bring out Eliza Parsons is it points to something that kind of Radcliffe or female Gothic recipe often elides or erases. The fact that a lot of Gothic novels from the 1790s particularly don't have this nice little linear plot. We already saw in The Romance of the Forest that there are some subplots clearly happening, different characters in different places having different things happen to them, from Adeline's adventures to Theodore's imprisonment, for example. But in a lot of Gothic novels, it's much more extreme than that. And we have a lot of inset narratives. Mysterious Warnings is a really clear case of this, where you have a male primary figure, a male protagonist, who is sort of wandering around, meeting lots of people and learning their stories. And so we get lots of different stories from lots of different perspectives. The picture actually refers to a story written basically from the first person point of view of a serial killer, which is not perhaps what we expect when we read that recipe of female Gothic. The last book I've included, and it's snipped off the top of the title, is Ethelwina or the House of Fitzalban by T.J. Horsley Curtis. This is written by a man, and the reason I include it is to show the ways in which books that do seem to fit that recipe or paradigm can also be written by men as well. So we've had a look at this concept of diversity, but let's get back to that sort of idea of challenging the ways in which these recipes limit our understanding of texts. And I want to take us into now our discussion of virtue as it appears in Romance of the Forest. Now, this is a theme which is clearly very central to the text. It is both how we start the novel, this is the first couple of lines, and it's how we end the novel. So we start with this meditation in some ways on virtue. When one's sordid interest seizes on the heart, it freezes up the source of every warm and liberal feeling. It is an enemy alike to virtue and to taste. This it perverts, and that it annihilates. At the end of the book, we have a moral as well. And this is how the novel ends, again taking us back to the topic of virtue. Their former lives afforded an example of trials well endured, and their present of virtues greatly rewarded. And this reward they continued to deserve, for not to themselves was their happiness contracted, but diffused to all who came within the sphere of their influence. The indigent and unhappy rejoiced in their benevolence, the virtuous and enlightened in their friendship, and their children in parents whose example impressed upon their hearts the precepts offered to their understandings. Now, if we're taking a fairly formulaic view of this, we might think, okay, well, we've got a fairly standard moral there at the end. The good end up happy, the bad end up in bad circumstances. And that's certainly true. But I'd like to argue that Radcliffe is doing something a lot more than just putting in a formulaic moral at the end of her story. Instead, I'd like to suggest that throughout Romance of the Forest, she is engaging in lots of different ways with different ethical, moral, theological, and philosophical constructions of virtue. And if we look in a little bit more detail at each of these quotes, and I've done this to some extent by highlighting in bold, we can see that she is engaging with particular ideas of virtue. So in her introduction, she highlights this idea of sordid interest, tying the corruption of virtue specifically to money and greed. So there is this kind of setup already where we're perhaps juxtaposing the city and also kind of a proto-capitalism against this kind of country life. and against these traditional forms of life. So we're already seeing how she might be setting up some dichotomies, but also how she is sort of really anxious, perhaps, about the role of money in the corruption of virtue. We also have her saying that these are an enemy to virtue and to taste. So she's suggesting that virtue and taste are not synonymous with each other, but she is linking them together. And in doing so, she's entering into 18th century debates about the concept of morality and specifically moral taste, i.e., where our sense of morality comes from. And there's a lot of arguments in the 18th century about this idea of an inbuilt taste, or as morality as sort of linked to taste and feeling. So as a response that's linked to feeling. And we'll see that Radcliffe explores that quite a lot in the text, but she's also a little bit wary of that concept of taste on its own. In the ending, we see what appears to be a fairly standard formulation of virtue greatly rewarded. But what we have underlying this implicitly is a concept of providence. So this is a providence and a sense of divine justice. And this is underlined by the rest of the narrative as well, where it said that Adeline was chosen to be an instrument of divine vengeance. But it also takes us a little bit into a deeper questioning about providence. So there are different models and understandings of providence, but two basic ones are natural providence, where God kind of set everything up in advance, sets it going, the natural laws of the world and how everything works. And he sets it going so that, it results in the good for the good, essentially. But the concept of active providence includes an idea of God interacting more actively in life as it's going on, not just setting everything up at the beginning, but continually interacting with humankind. And the fact that this text has this series of supernatural dreams in it suggests that Radcliffe is producing here a concept of active providence. So you see, it's not quite as simple as it perhaps looks. We also have her laying out her concept of what virtue is or how it is lived out. So she says of Theodore and Adeline, not to themselves was their happiness contracted, but diffused to all who came within the sphere of their influence. And we see here what we're going to see as a constant theme throughout the novel, which is an emphasis on active virtue, on sensibility and on virtue lived out through action and beneficence. So I'm going to look at some different discourses within the novel now, and I'm going to start with that concept of negative virtue that's in the title of the talk. And taking this concept of negative virtue from Radcliffe's own vocabulary and using her definition of it. It comes up at a point where Louis Lamotte, so the son of the Lamotte family, is wandering around the abbey and thinking of the life of the monks who lived there before. Here, said he, are probably deposited the ashes of some ancient monk, once an inhabitant of the abbey, perhaps of the founder, who after having spent a life of abstinence and prayer, sought in heaven the reward of his forbearance upon earth. Peace be to his soul. But did he think a life of mere negative virtue deserved an eternal reward? Mistaken man. Reason, had you trusted to its dictates, would have informed you that the active virtues, the adherence to the golden rule, do as you would be done unto, could alone deserve the favor of a deity whose glory is benevolence. So here he rejects negative virtue, understanding negative virtue as sort of the self-withdrawal from temptation. You isolate yourself, and so that your virtue is only a kind of passive form that exists in not doing wrong, but not actively doing good and not meeting temptation either. He refers to his own sense of what virtue is as the golden rule. And now this kind of phrasing of it as the golden rule takes us back to specifically 18th century development of this sort of naming convention. And this sense of virtue as being intrinsically tied to action. Now, of course, we could see this critique of monastic isolationism as just a standard bit of anti-Catholicism. But if any of you know me, you already know that it's not going to just be that. But we do have, of course, in the Gothic, a set of fairly standard theological critiques, which directly attack the cloistral theologies of monasticism. So encoded in a negative depiction of monastic life and frequently mused upon by Gothic protagonists is a view of monasticism's vow of celibacy as unnatural and vitiating. cloistral separation from secular life as a cowardly retreat from the world, productive of only negative virtue, which is what we're seeing here, and its legalistic practices as the fount of hypocrisy. So there are this fairly standard kind of realm of critique, but as Robert Miles points out, the Gothic depiction of the Catholic is not simply other, but also a complex foil which cues us into some of the 18th century sources of internal Protestant British unease. In other words, this critique of Catholicism doesn't necessarily just stop with Catholicism, but instead Catholicism becomes something which is critiqued, but through it, we are critiquing broader kind of Protestant behaviors, Protestant theologies, and the actions, particularly of the Anglican Church as a state church. So critiques of the Catholic Church as a persecuting church in many of these novels, depictions, for example, of the Inquisition, can become a critique of a persecuting state church more broadly. As I've talked about before, and there is a talk up on the channel where I talk about tolerance debate in the early Gothic, it's important to think about anti-Catholicism and not just think of it as this kind of monolithic and overdetermined term, where we're using anti-Catholicism equally to talk about somebody who's pondering some monks in quite a positive way, but being like, if only they'd realize that the better way is to be more active in their virtue. We're comparing that to sort of the active political persecution of Catholics and having those be exactly the same thing. Instead, I'd like to suggest that we kind of look at different sort of forms of anti-Catholicism. One of them is theological critique. We are critiquing particular theologies, and this easily extends beyond a critique of Catholicism. And what we'll see in that critique of negative virtue is that this becomes a central theme of the text, particularly within the depiction of Pierre de la Motte. Theological intolerance is not the same thing. This is the rejection of a group outside the kind of united Church of Christ, or the sort of a whole Church of Christ, as being essentially unchristian. And what you might have noticed in Louis' meditation is he does say, peace be upon his soul. He doesn't suggest that this monk or abbot wasn't saved, but rather that, you know, he's theologically critiquing him, but he's not casting him out of the church per se. Similarly, we can have a political critique of how the Catholic Church is working, which doesn't necessarily link to a lack of political tolerance. Indeed, we can have a double movement where the kind of persecuting church is critiqued, which then leads us towards kind of a model of the church which is less persecuting, which is more open, which has a policy of toleration, which then interestingly kind of doubles back and makes us more tolerant or suggests tolerance towards Catholics. So if we look at this here, we're going to see that it does extend. It's a theological critique which can be extended beyond Catholic Church. Instead, it's a critique of negative virtue, of isolationism, and a passive virtue which only exists without temptation. Also, we're seeing here some of the things that will be picked up on later in this talk as kind of central to the practice of virtue, where he talks about the activity of virtue, but also about the role of reason in virtue. And I'll come back to that in a second. But let's have a look at how negative virtue impacts a character in the text and is explored through a secular character, which is Pierre de la Motte, the father of the family. And he is somebody who is quite grayscale through some of the text. He starts the text being compassionate and rescuing this girl. He then betrays her, as I've detailed in the middle. But by the end of the novel, Adeline has some pity for him and his family. That isn't to excuse what he's doing, but Radcliffe is not simply giving us a black and white picture of villains and heroes in this text. But what is the key to Pierre de la Motte's failure as a virtuous figure? Well, we have this description of him right at the beginning of the novel, where we're told that he was a man whose passions often overcame his reason, and for a time silenced his conscience. But though the image of virtue which nature had impressed upon his heart was sometimes obscured by the passing influence of vice, it was never wholly obliterated. With strength of mind sufficient to have withstood temptation, he would have been a good man. As it was, he was always a weak and sometimes a vicious member of society. Yet his mind was active and his imagination vivid, which, cooperating with the force of passion, often dazzled his judgment and subdued principle. Thus, he was a man infirm in purpose and visionary in virtue. In a word, his conduct was suggested by feeling rather than principle, and his virtue, such as it was, could not stand the pressure of occasion. So you're going to see in a moment, we're going to talk about more positive models of virtue, and we're going to talk about the hero of sensibility. I want you to bear Pierre de la Motte and this description in mind, because you're going to see a lot of crossover with things that are brought out as symptoms of sensibility. Imagination, for example, feeling. There's also this sense that he has that natural taste, as it were, for virtue, but that isn't enough. He allows his emotions to overrule his reason, but more importantly, to overrule his principle. Essentially, he doesn't really have secure principles. Instead, he's like a weather vane that is spinning around in the direction of whatever the prevailing breeze is, and he cannot stand the pressure of occasion. So we have the kind of turning point for him in the middle, where he betrays Adeline because he had neither resolution nor virtue sufficient to reject the terms that the Marquis de Montalt offers him. The jewels that he'd stolen were restored, and he consented to betray the innocent Adeline. So he fails here as a virtuous figure within the text, and he fails specifically as well as a father figure. And we'll go on to that idea of the way in which the text interacts with different father figures. I want to point us towards Madame La Motte to show another example of this kind of failure of virtue through this kind of negative virtue, the untested virtue. But I want to suggest that Madame La Motte is even more grayscale, as it were, than Pierre de la Motte. And Radcliffe highlights the nature of virtuous dilemmas which are faced by these characters. For her, Pierre de la Motte's situation isn't a dilemma at all. He is ruled by his ego and his selfishness to do terrible things, including betraying Adeline. Madame La Motte, however, is depicted as being in a much more difficult position. Madame La Motte, condemned to the horrible alternative of permitting the seduction of innocence or of dooming her husband to destruction, suffered a distraction of thought which defied all control. Perceiving, however, that in opposition to the designs of the Marquis would ruin La Motte and avail Adeline little, she determined to yield and endure in silence. Now, Radcliffe specifically calls Madame La Motte out eventually as being kind of ruled by selfish motives, but we do see here a sense of dilemma. She makes the wrong choice and she betrays Adeline, refusing for both herself and her husband to take responsibility for their own actions. But then why should she take responsibility for the actions of her husband is a question the text also asks, because she hasn't really done anything wrong in Paris, but she still is tied to his fate throughout. But the text kind of forces us to confront, well, how do we solve a moral dilemma then? What are the things that we need to bring into focus? Well, we need to exercise not only feeling, it's not strong enough. We also need to exercise reason. But as I'll go on to later, Radcliffe suggests that reason also isn't enough. That can lead us into saying the sophistical justifications of our poor behavior. So we have to rely as well on that sense of feeling and of moral taste. But she underlines as key ideas of principle, of having a set of principles which you stick to, and also developing a firmness of habit. And you can't develop a firmness of habit if you don't interact with the world. Now, this isn't Radcliffe saying you should put yourself in the way of temptation in order to trust and prove your virtue, but rather she's saying there is no virtue in removing yourself from the day-to-day challenges, and that you need to build up that firmness of habit in little things in order to confront these larger kind of virtuous dilemmas. Now, we've talked about the negative and how virtue goes wrong here, but what about the positive? What are these heroes doing and how are they connected to virtue? Well, I want to first of all separate off and say that there are two kind of forms of heroism which are being depicted in the text. There are kind of romantic possibilities, romantic heroes, and also father figures. There are a number of father figures in the text for Adeline. So one of them is Pierre de la Motte, whose virtue fails him, as we've seen. There's also Leluc, the father of Theodore, and the man who takes her in, not knowing who she is, actually, and not knowing her connection to Theodore when he does take her in. And he is probably kind of the best role model that we have in the text. We also have the man that she thought was her father, who is in the employ of the Marquis de Montault and also betrays her. And we also have, weirdly, the Marquis de Montault, because he is her uncle. He's kind of in loco parentis in some ways, and it's his kind of estates and money, or the money that and estates that he has usurped, that Adeline ends up inheriting at the end of the novel. Of course, he is the worst version of a corrupted father. But all of these positively imagined characters, both romantic heroes and kind of father figures, are heroes of sensibility to a great extent. As Markman Ellis notes, her heroes represent a sentimentally informed, reformed masculinity. And this idea of the hero of sensibility is mentioned in a lot of criticism. And I think Peter Thorsleiv's definition of a hero of sensibility gives us a good place to start in thinking about what defines them. Heroes of sensibility, he argues, as the hero who is distinguished not by daring exploits or superior intelligence, but quite simply by his capacity for feeling, mostly for the tender emotions, gentle and tearful love, nostalgia, and a pervasive melancholy that ranges from autumnal musings to graveyard moralizing, and with occasional lapses into charnel house sensationalism. So if you think of Frankenstein, that last bit fits him. But we have this emphasis, as we can see, on emotion and feeling as being principal characteristics. Now, that's not where the story ends, of course. But what I want to point out in this discussion, and the details that we're going into about what kind of makes a hero and what makes a virtuous hero, is the fact that in this kind of 1790s period, the late 18th century, you have kind of a lot of women writing en masse. You have women kind of taking over the pen to a great extent. There's that famous comment in Persuasion by Jane Austen where the character Anne says, well, can you really trust novels' depictions of women? Because they've all been written by men. But here we're seeing the flip side of that. We're seeing women taking the pen and not only writing female heroines, but also writing heroes and trying to articulate and navigate new concepts or different concepts of masculinity, both romantic masculinity and paternal masculinity, and provide models of it, but also kind of approach it with worries and anxieties as well in the background, as we will see. I've said that these are heroes of sensibility. So what is sensibility? As a discourse, it has its kind of key era in the 18th century. By the early 19th century, and even in the late 18th century, you're already beginning to see quite a lot of critiques of the weak points of sensibility. And we'll think about those again in a moment. It's often associated with women, particularly because of the writing like people like Mary Wollstonecraft, who notes how sensibility has been deployed as against women often, and the ways in which that kind of emphasis on emotional receptivity and kind of natural inbuilt emotional response has been something that has taken women's kind of connection to reason and autonomy and corrupted it, essentially. So she is quite critical of the way in which sensibility and gender are related to each other. However, it's worth noting that in the 18th century, sensibility is a discourse which is not confined just to women. And we're going to see some writers thinking about that. And it's also worth noting that sensibility is a model that is being used for both female and male protagonists of Radcliffe's novels and a lot of early Gothic novels. And we'll go back to think a bit more about that. But I want to sort of introduce some of the key aspects of sensibility through this poem by Hannah More. This is only a tiny portion of it, so do feel free to go and read the whole thing. But here in Sensibility, a Poetic Epistle, she says, what is wit and what the poet's art? Can genius shield the vulnerable heart? Ah, no, where bright imagination reigns, the fine wrought spirit feels acuter pains. Where glow exalted sense and taste refined, there keener anguish rankles in the mind. Their feeling is diffused through every part, thrills in each nerve and lives in all the heart. And those whose generous souls each tear would keep from others' eyes are born themselves to weep. So what are some of the key features here of sensibility? Well, there's an emphasis on imagination and emotion, emotional receptivity and response, and particularly empathy, which results in your own kind of physical and emotional suffering. And one of the downsides of sensibility is being articulated here, this sense that it affects you very deeply. But also one of the critiques of sensibility will come to be that what you end up doing is you respond emotionally to everything, but then you forget to actually do anything about it. And this is a sort of worry as well that we're going to see reflected in Radcliffe. There's also an emphasis on taste, as we can see here, an exalted sense. So there is this connection to reason, I would argue, as well, although we mostly associate sensibility with emotion. So how does this apply to our hero? I almost want to put it in inverted commas, but our hero, Theodore. Well, he demonstrates all of these traits of empathy, emotion, delicacy, and taste. In this passage here, this is after he has rescued Adeline for the first time, which is very unsuccessful. And they're sitting together in this carriage, and he just wants to declare his love to her, but his delicacy forbids him from doing so. So he demonstrates this exquisite delicacy and taste in how he reacts to her. We also see him being filled with emotion. He's anxious, although he is at the moment kind of relieved from some of his apprehension, which he shouldn't be because they are being chased, but there you go. But this kind of emotion is powered in great part by his empathy. He knows of her destitute condition and the dangers which she's faced, and that leads him towards pity. But there's also this emphasis on perhaps an overemphasis on the emotional reaction of the person with sensibility, where he's saying the distress he suffered when compelled to leave her exposed to dangers is like, no, what could be worse? I'm like, well, probably being exposed to the dangers, my friend. The perfect man, as described within this text, though I want to highlight, is similar to the heroine. So there is a similarity of taste and opinion, which at first attracted them, and every moment was now more fully disclosed. Their discourse was enriched by elegant literature and endeared by mutual regard. Adeline had enjoyed few opportunities of reading, but the books to which she had access, operating upon a mind eager for knowledge and upon a taste peculiarly sensible of the beautiful and the elegant, had impressed all their excellences upon her understanding. And Theodore had received from nature many of the qualities of genius, and from education all that it could bestow. To these were added a noble independency of spirit, a feeling heart, and manners which partook of a happy mixture of dignity and sweetness. That last section, you could swap out the pronouns quite easily, swap out the kind of attachment of that description to Theodore, and it would equally well describe Adeline. So there is a lot of similarity between hero and heroine in this model of sensibility as heroism. And that's something that Markman Ellis points out. He notes that Radcliffe's protagonists exist entirely inside parameters of virtue with which young persons of both genders could identify. So in the 18th century, as I've noted, discourses of sensibility are not being confined just to women all of the time. And I want to point us towards David Hume's writing on what he calls the delicacy of passion and the delicacy of taste, which I read it as being basically identical with the discourse of sensibility. But in delineating between these two forms, he delineates a dangerous form of sensibility and a correct, for want of a better word, form of sensibility. And what we find in the novels of Radcliffe is her heroes and her heroines are often trying to navigate these kind of the shoals of sensibility as well, and its dangers as well as its positives. In this book, I would argue Adeline, throughout most of the novel, usually demonstrates an already developed kind of sense of sensibility, of virtue, principle, correct interpretation of the supernatural. In books like The Mysteries of Udolpho, there's more of a Bildungsroman, whereas here we're seeing the heroines kind of almost fully formed erupting into the novel. But it's the heroes who have to take a journey and control the excesses of their sensibility to give us a more kind of reassuring, heroic, romantic version of sensibility, or in the case of the father figures, a more secure and solid version of sensibility. Delicacy of passion is the thing to avoid, and I think we can see how it applies to Theodore quite easily. So Hume says some people are subject to certain delicacy of passion, which makes them extremely sensible or sensitive to all the accidents of life and gives them a lively joy upon every prosperous event, as well as a piercing grief when they meet with misfortunes and adversities. In other words, it's somebody who goes between emotional extremes, reacting to everything that happens in their life. And he notes that men of such lively passions are apt to be transported beyond all bounds of prudence and discretion, to take false steps in the conduct of life which are often irretrievable, which is exactly what we see happening with Theodore, where he makes a series of rash decisions, including in his rescue of Adeline, but also, for example, when he is sort of found by the military who are kind of arresting him for deserting, instead of responding in a way which could de-escalate the situation, he refuses to even sort of go with them or talk to them because Adeline has fainted, or because Adeline is kind of fainting. And instead he ends up having a duel, which leads to him being almost mortally wounded because he's being led by his passions and emotions rather than his reason in any of these situations. The appropriate model that Hume lays out for us is a delicacy of taste, which very much resembles the delicacy of passion and produces the same sensibility to beauty and deformity of every kind as that does to prosperity and adversity, obligations and injuries. So the contrast between them is the delicacy of passion is moved by anything that happens, whereas the delicacy of taste refers to the sensibility or sensitivity to beauty and deformity. And although there's this ableist phrasing here, deformity, this is not being referred to simply kind of a sense of human beauty and deformity, but rather these terms are being used to apply to kind of aesthetic, ethical, moral, virtue, beauties of in every sort of sense. And deformity here meaning the flip side of that, or if we're thinking virtue and vice, for example. With delicacy of taste, our judgment will strengthen by the exercise of this taste, and we shall form juster notions of life. So judgment is involved, which means reason is involved. And there's also that habit that is involved, which will lead us to juster notions of life. So if our romantic hero of sensibility is still on a journey working out how to be a hero of sensibility that's actually functional, we have an older example, Leluc, the father figure, who represents a sort of fully formed version of the hero of sensibility. Now, as many critics have noted, he resembles in many ways the Savoyard vicar of Rousseau from Emile. So in Rousseau's Emile, we have the Savoyard vicar described as a good priest who was naturally humane and compassionate. His own misfortunes had taught him to feel for those of others, nor had prosperity hardened his heart. In a word, the maxims of true wisdom and conscious virtue had confirmed the kindness of his natural disposition. He cordially embraced the young wanderer, provided for him a lodging, and shared with him the slender means of his own subsistence. Nor was this all. He went still further, freely giving him both instruction and consolation, and endeavoring to teach him the difficult art of supporting adversity with patience. Again, we see here these key motifs of emotion and empathy, but these have been combined with wisdom and reason and put in the pathway of active virtue, not simply a constant emotional response to the world, a reactivity, if you will. Something notable in Rousseau's Emile is that the Savoyard vicar has a religion of nature and reason. And this is something that we're going to see as a slight difference with Leluc, not very overtly, but what we find in Rousseau is this idea of natural religion based on what can be known from the natural world and the exercise of reason. Radcliffe, though, includes this kind of continued emphasis on revealed religion. So Leluc returns constantly to scriptural concepts of morality and life and religion. And he, in doing so, puts an emphasis on received religion and also on kind of an emotional religion. But we can see a lot of similarities. Like the Savoyard vicar, his mind was penetrating, his views extensive, his systems, like his religion, was simple, rational, and sublime. We see him as an empathetic and an active figure. The people of his parish looked up to him as to a father, for while his precepts directed their minds, his example touched their hearts. And we also see him engaging in that kind of painful empathy. Calamity taught him to feel with peculiar sympathy the distresses of others. In this last comment, though, we do see some, I think, anxieties that Radcliffe has about the hero of sensibility and the limits of the hero of sensibility. So we hear that his income from the parish was small, and he could not always relieve the necessities of the indigent. His tender pity and holy conversation seldom failed in administering consolation to the mental sufferer. That line always trips me up because nothing annoys me more than people being like, I can't help you, but like, let's have a chat about how sad you are. No, I really just need a biscuit, thank you. But what's happening here, we're seeing the limits of him as a hero of sensibility here. This is something, again, that Ellis points out, that Radcliffe explores the behavior of men of sensibility, but while she invests their model with much moral significance, she also expresses anxiety about their power in the world. So she expresses anxiety about the dangers of sensibility, as we see in Theodore, but also that sense of powerlessness. And we see this exercise in the Luke and the example I've just given you, but also on a broader scale, for example, when Theodore is imprisoned and there is nothing that the Luke can do to save him. Nothing that he can do to save his own son, despite sort of collapsing in tears at the feet of the king. Sensibility has its limits. I also want to just kind of finish by taking us back to this idea that Radcliffe is perhaps borrowing from Rousseau in the Savoyard Vicar, because I don't want to give the impression that Radcliffe is uncritically engaging with Rousseau. Instead, like some other female writers of the period, including perhaps really notably Mary Shelley, she engages with Rousseau in ways that are quite critical, and she is suspicious of this concept of reason alone and the natural world leading us towards morality and God. Instead, she points to an idea of natural vice. She's basing her thoughts on a kind of theological concept of original sin, I would argue, where everyone is tainted with vice. And she shows that there's so many things in the natural world and those around us which are not either vicious or virtuous in and of themselves, but our interpretation of them leads them to be either or both. So she notes that vicious inclinations not only corrupt the heart, but the understanding, and thus lead to false reasoning. Reason, therefore, becomes vulnerable, the victim of natural vice or vicious inclinations. And we see this kind of idea of the reception of things in nature or things in the world as being what defines their virtue or their vice or their effect or relationship to virtue and vice. So the example I want to give is music. Because right at the beginning of the book, we have La Motte in a quite a tender moment at the chapel of the abbey, thinking about the music of the monks. And here, music is valorized as a sort of sublime force which elevates and leads us towards devotion and penitence. However, we see music used very differently by the Marquis de Montalt, where he uses music to try and seduce Adeline. We hear that the music ceased, but the sound still vibrated on her imagination, and she was sunk in the pleasing languor they had inspired when the door opened and the Marquis de Montalt appeared. So this last part isn't the quote, it's my comment on the quote, and I keep forgetting to change the editing, apologies. But here we see that music can seduce as well as elevate. And we need moral taste and practice to discern it. We need wariness to ward us against it. What we're finding, I think, in Radcliffe is an anxiety about libertine philosophers and philosophy who disguise their licentiousness behind a veneer of new philosophy. And Charles Lucas, in his introduction to The Child of Sin, is very clear what this new philosophy is. And he points to Rousseau, among others, viewing them in their lives, at the least, as libertine philosophers. And we see this reflected in Radcliffe, particularly in a speech by the Marquis de Montalt, where he uses nature and sophistical reasoning to justify his own attempts to rape and then murder Adeline. So he says, nature uncontaminated by false refinement everywhere acts alike in the great occurrences of life. The Indian, and here he's referring to Native Americans, I believe, discovers his friend to be perfidious and he kills him. The wild Asiatic does the same. The Turk, when ambition fires or revenge provokes, gratifies his passion at the expense of life and does not call it murder. Even the polished Italian, distracted by jealousy or tempted by a strong circumstance of advantage, draws his stiletto and accomplishes his purpose. It is the first proof of a superior mind to liberate itself from prejudices of country or of education. So obviously, this is a very racist list of stereotypes here. What we're also seeing is the Marquis de Montalt using this as a sort of sense of it's very natural to murder people. It's something that we can see around the world. And the reason why we don't want to just murder everyone is false refinement. It's the prejudices, it's education. So he's using a Rousseauvian logic here, which juxtaposes civilization and nature, and using it to justify his own natural vice. One of the reasons I think that Radcliffe is so uncertain about this kind of Rousseauvian philosophy is because of her own theology. And this is what I'm going to end on. Because for her, the natural world and natural reason are not unbiased and not uncorrupted in terms of leading us to concepts of virtue. We see in this novel Adeline referring to the mountains as walking over the ruins of the world. And in doing so, she's referring us back to Thomas Burnet's sacred theory of the earth, who says we have still the broken materials of that first world and walk upon its ruins. For Burnet, he views the world as we see it today as the result of both the fall and the flood. For him, at the flood, what happens is the rain doesn't come from above, but there's an outer crust that breaks open and the water comes from below. But the outer crust breaking open is what forms the mountains and the current topography of the world. So the world as we see it today is a reflection of a fallen world. And so it cannot lead us unambiguously to God or to virtue. There are sort of different models that apply to how we might read the world and how it can reflect the divine and the virtuous. Augustine, although he argues for original sin, of course, also points to the essential goodness of the world. Luther to its essential depravity. But Radcliffe is more aligned with Calvin, who points to it as a cursed and spoiled, yet essentially the same world as at the beginning, capable of drawing us to God or to virtue. But we need something intercepting between us in the world as well. We need revealed religion, we need principle, and we need the exercise of reason and the practice of moral taste and moral virtue. So, hopefully that has been an interesting talk. Hopefully it's given you some new ways to look at the text, and thank you for listening.